Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes the Reverend Ben Crosby to the show. Ben Crosby is a priest of the Episcopal Church USA, currently serving in the Anglican Church of Canada. He is also a PhD student in ecclesiastical history at McGill University, where he studies the English Reformation. Ben is passionate about church renewal in the contemporary mainline, Christian discipleship and spirituality, and what the Christian past, especially the 16th century, might have to say about Christian life today. He has been published in Plough, The Anglican Way, Earth and Altar, The Hour, and Faith Lead. You can read more at bencrosby.substack.com. As always, please take a moment to subscribe and review the podcast. We appreciate it also if you can share this episode with a friend. You can connect with Martha and Lauren and Future Christian on Instagram. Thanks, and as always, enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your host for today's episode, Martha Tatarnic, and today I'm really happy to be joined by the Reverend Ben Crosby. Welcome, Ben. It's so great to have been able to line up this conversation with you.
Thanks so much, Martha. Yes, really glad to be here.
Yeah, and Ben is joining us from across the pond, as they say. So we're navigating some different time zones and all of that jazz. But I'm so grateful that we were able to make this work in your busy schedule. So let's start with some opening questions so that our listeners can get to know you a little bit, Ben. Maybe you can just share with us a bit about your faith journey, what it has looked like in the past, and what it looks like now.
Absolutely. So I am a priest of the Episcopal Church in the United States. I'm currently serving in the Anglican Church of Canada while I am pursuing doctoral studies at McGill University in Montreal. I didn't grow up Anglican, though. I actually grew up in the Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Oh, okay.
Yes, exactly. Found my way sort of around college to the mainline over questions like the place of women or LGBTQ people in the church, and ended up, after spending some time sort of figuring out the Lutheran versus Anglican question, sort of felt like the Episcopal Church in the States or Anglican Church in Canada would sort of be the best home. Pursued ordination there. I've been a priest for a couple of years now. I think for me, one of the most important moments of my faith journey was a moment really in the middle of college where, well, the way I like to say it is I think I was finally forced to confront grace as reality and not just a sort of theological postulate.
Right.
I grew up in a church that certainly talked a lot about grace, about salvation being God's work, not ours, about our relationship with God not resting on our own accomplishments and efforts, but as a sort of type A high achiever in kind of North American culture. I could say the right words, but maybe didn't quite feel that in my heart. But I think had a moment in college where I actually really struggled with both physical and mental illness. Had to take a little time off from school, and finally, was forced to this place where I could no longer achieve or accomplish or sort of do much of all, or much of anything rather, and was forced, I think, to really accept God's love and the love of those around me as something that is not earned by me, ticking all the right boxes, but it's just given out of sheer and unmerited love. And so I hope that that sharing the grace that I have received is at the heart of my own ministry and Christian life today.
Well, my gosh, as a fellow type A, can I ever relate to what you just said? Yeah, it's amazing how easily I can slip into the striving and the box ticking, and yet God has a way of confronting me with my own weaknesses and with the reality of grace. So, yeah. Do you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about what you're doing now and why you're across the pond?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm doing, as I said, a doctorate in church history right now at McGill. I study the Church of England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, so the second half of the 16th century, looking at the relationship between the Church of England and the Reformed and Lutheran churches on the continent. And so I've had an opportunity with my wife, who's actually also a church history PhD student, to spend a year doing some research abroad. And so we have been in the UK for a couple of months now, and we'll be in Zurich for most of the rest of the spring. And it's just been really a great gift and blessing to get to spend time in the places where it happened, for the things that I study, and visit some archives, see some manuscripts that I can't see anywhere other than being in person, and getting to meet with some Reformation scholars sort of over here and in Switzerland.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, we have to have some offline conversations because I'm working on a book about Anne Boleyn and her influence on the Reformation, and it's coming out next year. So can we talk?
Let's talk.
That would be really, really helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that sounds like great fun. I would love to do that.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I had no idea that was your topic. So this is just really exciting. I find it hard these days to talk about anything other than 16th century Tudor England. So, God must have brought us together for this conversation.
Amen.
Okay. So, not to take all our listeners down that rabbit hole right now, but Ben, is there a spiritual practice that is particularly meaningful to you right now as you're in the midst of all of these exciting studies and traveling abroad?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has really been the anchor of my spiritual life for a long time now, actually, for probably 15 years, and was really instrumental in leading me to the Anglican Church, actually, is the daily office. So spending some time in the morning and in the evening, praying psalms, sort of being steeped in scripture, praying for the church, for the world. I think as someone for whom extemporaneous prayer does not always come easily, I think having sort of words to say, words given to me by God to say, the words of the Psalms, the words of Scripture to sort of to take in, to internalize, to spend time with every day, day in, day out, year in, year out, is really such a blessing. And so I think, yes, I think the daily office, morning and evening prayer, can't say enough good things about it as sort of grounding my spiritual life and just my life in general.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people we talk to in these interviews who name that as like such a powerful spiritual practice, and not just Anglicans. I find it really interesting. And, as somebody who's quite like naturally introverted, it is the words that God gives us, but it's also the words that like connect us to community, even when we're alone, which is, I find, extremely powerful.
No, that's really well said. There's something very special about knowing, even as you say, if you are just praying it by yourself, that you are praying the same prayers that Christians across the world are praying, that Christians across time are praying. I mean, it does feel there's like this very concrete way to be part of the communion of saints.
Yeah. Yeah. You can really feel that. All right. Well, thank you for just giving us that little sketch. So I want to talk about some of your writing in particular, but let's just talk about your writing in general to start with. You write a regular Substack blog, and you reflect on a variety of topics that contribute to the life of the Anglican Church and I think the Church in general. Are there main areas of interest for you as a Christian writer and leader? Is there a theme to the blogs and articles that you write, or is it just sort of following the spirit?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, if I think about them, I think they probably tend to fall into a couple of overlapping categories. I think one, and I know we're going to be talking a little bit about this, for most of our conversation today, is kind of the question of the state of the mainline, about what sort of renewal might look like in the mainline, what sort of cleaving more closely to Jesus might look like, for us in this time of particular sort of challenges and stresses in a lot of our church bodies. I think I'm also interested in discipleship and spirituality, sort of thinking about what for me and what perhaps for others as well, might be a pathway into to deeper life with Christ, to a life that is sort of patterned more fully as a grateful response to what God has done for us in Christ Jesus. And then the third is really trying, I guess, to bridge the gap a little bit between my academic work and my more sort of public-facing writing or day-to-day ministry, sort of asking, what church history and perhaps especially, so the 16th century that I spend most of my time in as an academic, what it might have to tell us, to enrich our lives of faith today. So renewal, discipleship and spirituality, and sort of church history for the present. I think those are the sorts of themes that I'm trying to reflect and foster a conversation about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that those are such important themes, and I really like that you tie in the church history piece into that conversation as well, because I think that we're in such a moment in history, and I think that translates into the life of the church as well, where, if we don't remember where we've been, I think it's really hard to be faithful about where we're going.
Yeah,
so
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, so you got a lot of airtime for an article that you wrote just before Christmas called The Current State of the Anglican Church. There was a lot of online conversation about it. I know in Anglican circles, it really packed a punch, and obviously we're having this conversation on Future Christian because I think that the topic is relevant way beyond just the Anglican Church. But we need to kind of frame this article, The Current State of the Anglican Church, on another article that came out this past August and that also got a lot of airtime. So I think we just need to recap that initial article so that then we can talk about your response to that article. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm just going to read directly from your piece, that article that you wrote, where you recap the August article. Hopefully our listeners are not getting too confused by all of these articles. Okay, so I'm just reading from your piece. This summary. David Goodhue published a piece in the Living Church's Covenant blog entitled The Collapse of the Anglican Church of Canada, in which he argued the Anglican Church of Canada is the first province of the Anglican Communion to have collapsed. He pointed out a sharp decline in average Sunday attendance, but stressed that attendance decline, along with financial woes, are lagging indicators. Rather, he argued that the key metrics of ecclesial health are baptism numbers and age profile, and that on these measures, the ACC has already collapsed with no recovery in sight. He blames this decline in particular on the Anglican Church of Canada's progressivism, and in particular a focus on progressive causes, which led to individual discipleship and church growth being minimized. So I think that offers us a fair summary of an article that got a lot of Canadian Anglicans really up in arms. And I really, really appreciate it. There were a bunch of responses to that David Goodhue piece, but I really appreciated your response as a very measured and thoughtful response. And I think that having a conversation with you to kind of dig into some of those claims that he makes is really important. And again, I think it just needs to be stressed that although this singled out the Anglican Church of Canada, it really should put mainline churches everywhere on blast, because, the things that he talks about are relevant way beyond the ACC. So what do you think was most helpful about this article, or like what most needed to be heard in what David Goodhue was arguing?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was willing. The fact that he's coming from outside the ACC might have made it easier for him to do so. But I think he was willing to just be very blunt about first of all, the sort of numerical realities of our church right now, and of what those numerical realities mean for how we think about whether or not the church is doing what God has commissioned it to do. So I think he has forced us, perhaps even in an occasionally somewhat sharp way, to really look hard at how the church is doing. I think it's so easy to look and see, well, we still have functioning dioceses, we still have functioning parishes, the kind of the institution is sort of, still kind of moving on, and it's easy to look at that and just assume, well, it sort of always will. Things may not be great, but they're more or less okay. And I think his article was an invitation to ask, well, what if things aren't actually okay? What if we really are in a crisis?
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about that numbers game a little bit, because, he certainly says, and you agree with him, that numbers do matter, that church growth numbers and numbers of people attending our churches, the ages of those people, numbers being baptized, that this all matters. So, I want to talk about kind of the pushback to that mattering, but what would be like kind of your main reason for saying, these statistics do tell us truth?
Yeah, I think I would say, just at the most basic level, that I think numbers matter, because I think people knowing Jesus matters. And I think that not perhaps the only, but the normative way that people come to know Jesus is through the ministry of the church. And so, I think that it's not just that, well, for institutional maintenance, we need to, have people in the pews, although we do for institutional maintenance. It's not even that for doing the sort of social justice witness that many in our church at present really want to sort of foreground as an as a central part of what we do, that you need to, have people around to do that effectively, although again, you do. But at the most basic level, I think that the numbers matter because people being Christian matters, and that behind those numbers, at some level, each of those numbers is a person who has, come to know God in Jesus, or hasn't. And so, yes, at the most basic level, I think that numbers matter because people knowing Jesus matters, and those numbers, not perfectly, sure, but really do reflect that happening or not.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your tying, like, knowing Jesus to the life of the church, because, the thing that I kind of say all the time is, like, if we want to walk with Jesus, then we are stuck with each other. Like, that is, like, the church is kind of a non-negotiable in terms of how Jesus set it up anyway. Like, we might be quite tempted to think it would just be a lot easier to follow Jesus on our own, especially when, the church can be so frustrating and broken and sinful. And, there's lots of times I think that all of us just want to leave it behind, but that's actually not on the table, like, as a possibility for being a follower of Jesus. We do have to be part of the life of community.
I think that's really well said. I mean, if you look at, the language that Paul uses in his epistles of being members of a body, I mean, that requires, as you say, being together. I mean, the picture that we get of the church throughout the book of Acts, it's sort of people coming to know Jesus and then coming to live a life of worship and service together. As you say, I think it's non-negotiable when it comes to following Jesus.
Okay, so I have some of my own thoughts about why there has been reluctance to agree that stats and numbers matter. Certainly there is pushback in our mainline circles around agreeing that you can establish church health simply based on the metrics. But what do you think that pushback is about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things going on, at least it seems to me. I think there are those who, rightly enough, want to draw our attention to the fact that the moments when the churches were larger were also moments in which, our churches were failing to follow Jesus well in some ways. I mean, in Canada, of course, we talk a lot, as we should, about the relationship between the church and Indigenous peoples, the history of the residential schools, so forth. And so I think people can get worried that, the sort of suggestion that numbers matter is a call to, return entirely to sort of an earlier model of church that was not perfect in some significant ways, right? I think there's also a very keen awareness, which I think is true enough, that, in moments in which Christianity is more culturally supported than it is now, the mere fact then that someone's going to church doesn't necessarily mean that they are a deeply committed disciple of Jesus, that, social pressures and things like that, are sort of caused a lot of people to go to church in the past. And again, true enough as far as that goes. I mean, all things considered, I'd rather have people in an opportunity to hear the gospel than not. But I do take the point. I do also think that, and this is one conversation that I think we often struggle to have because it's a hard one, but I think that one of the reasons there is pushback is that there is real disagreement in our churches about whether or not people following Jesus or not actually matters, right? I think there's a strain in our church that says, well, if people are finding a way to live that enables them to do good to their neighbor and find meaning and so on, does it really matter so much if that's, under the auspices of Christianity or not. I think the claim that there is something unique about Jesus that means that people should come and follow and devote their lives to him does rub up against some of the ways that I think we are accustomed to talk and live in an increasingly sort of pluralistic, to say nothing of secular society. And certainly there are unhelpful ways to make that argument to people. But I don't know. I just, both looking at the experience of my own life, looking at the testimony of Scripture, I can't really escape the claim that if Jesus really is good news, he's good news for everyone, and that we have a responsibility to share that good news with everyone. And I think that's something that there is some genuine disagreement about in a lot of mainline churches today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that those are two such insightful points, and I appreciate them being linked to one another because, I think the piece around recognizing that the numbers tell us something, but they don't tell us the whole story is really important. Like, you can have churches full of people and be really far away from Jesus, in certain ways anyway. But yeah, I think I think that's also just really helpful to name that in a pluralistic society, we haven't found a really helpful, consistent way of talking about Jesus mattering. Yeah. Okay, so I want to, I feel like there's a lot more we could dig into there, but I do want to talk about a few other pieces and then maybe circle back to the proclamation piece and the evangelism piece. So Lauren was really disappointed that he couldn't be part of today's conversation. He's been wanting to talk to you for a long time. And initially we tried to coordinate all three of our schedules, but we failed. So anyway, he sent along a few questions. So I'm going to just share one of his questions with you. He says, in some evangelical circles, social justice can be seen as a distraction from evangelism as opposed to a necessary part, whereas it seems the opposite is true in mainline circles, that any talk of spiritual conversion can be seen as a distraction from social justice. So what are your thoughts about that? What is the place of social justice and being an agent of societal change in the life of the church?
Yeah, I think this is another very good question. So a little bit about me that may be helpful for this. So before I was a minister, I was a union organizer, actually, with the Hotel Workers Union in Boston, Massachusetts. So spent a good deal of time in the sort of labor organizing and kind of labor politics world. It's one that I know well, and it's one that I care a lot about. And it's also one that I chose to leave when I became a minister. And so, I think my immediate answer is that I think Lauren is right to point this out. And I think the sort of very sharp division between, sort of gospel proclamation and kind of doing, sort of striving to do good, strive for a juster society in the world, is a mistake. So that's the first thing that I think that the evangelical version that is sort of wholly unwilling to talk about a kind of Christian social responsibility, or the sort of stereotyped evangelical version, and similarly the stereotyped sort of mainline version that reduces Christianity to sort of center left politics and nothing more. I think both of those miss the mark. That said, I do think that while there is a place for both, that sort of proclamation, evangelism, discipleship are uniquely the work of the institutional church in a way that justice work isn't, right? I mean, I think, and this is something that I've said before, if I thought that my primary vocation as a Christian in the world is to work for justice. And I think that that is a good and holy and Christian vocation. I would still be a union organizer. I wouldn't be a mainline Protestant minister, right? I mean, I think there is I think that oftentimes those who really want to sort of hit hard on the kind of church as an organ of justice, ironically, just like aren't terribly realistic about what, small and shrinking denominations actually have the wherewithal to accomplish concretely for the good of the world. And so, I think that much of the church's work sort of as church as institution rather than church as sort of the body of Christ, all Christians, is to sort of give people the nourishment theologically and spiritually and the sort of grounding that enables them to go out in their life, whatever it is, and work for justice. And I think there are certainly times and places where it is important for the church as institution to take a stand, for sure. But I really do worry that if we see ourselves as primarily a not very good or effective social service agency, rather than primarily about proclaiming the good news of redemption in Jesus Christ and inviting people into a life of gratitude following on that we've kind of missed the mark and have failed to either pursue proclamation or pursue justice in the way that we are most suited to do.
Yeah, I to some degree I find the either or nature of that conversation a bit confusing. And I mean, I say this as somebody whose life has been entirely in the mainline church, but even statistically, it seems here in Canada anyway, to be really clear that church-going Christians are hugely responsible for underwriting the social safety net in some pretty extraordinary ways, and that
too,
and that if that, and there's kind of a demographic reality of younger people not being part of churches, and also not giving to charitable organizations and not giving their time to charitable organizations. And I kind of look around my city in particular and wonder about the collapse of a lot of the feeding programs and shelters that we take for granted if the mainline church collapses, right?
Yep. No, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. Yes. And yes, no, I think that's absolutely right, sort of on the institutional level. And I think it's also true that one of the gifts the church can give people sort of committing to that work is providing the sort of theological grounding for what they're doing in a way that will enable you, hopefully, to avoid burnout or just being sort of overwhelmed by the scope of the world's suffering. Obviously there are many people who are indeed, sort of non-religious, who give very, very, very sacrificially and amazingly for, live lives of service and justice for the world.
Yeah, for sure.
For me, speaking personally though, I would have found the work that I did, as a union organizer so overwhelming and impossible if I wasn't able to sort of take it every night to the Lord in prayer and to sort of trust that that God is in fact sovereign and working all things for good and all this, that otherwise, but what I needed when I was really in the sort of front lines of kind of social justice, social transformation work, was not a church that was trying to sort of roll out a less good programmatic version of what I was already doing, but a church that was going to tell me the truth of the good news of, God's work for the world and Jesus, and how that this shows his love for all creation and all of us and his determination to reconcile us to himself,
Yeah, I hear that. And, I think it's something that I try to be aware of as a preacher, is that it is easy in the mainline church to get into, as they say, just giving good advice or giving people jobs to do, and making sure that, like, I am proclaiming the good news, that it's about grace, because it's easy to fall into that trap.
So
I think.
easy. No, I mean, one of my favorite pieces of preaching advice that I've really tried to put to heart and take to heart and put into practice in my own preaching is from Fleming Rutledge, who is an Episcopal priest in the States, who says, that she always tries to end her sermons sort of not in the imperative mood, but in the indicative, not sort of giving people a list of things to do, but announcing for them, what God has already done for them in Christ. And I mean, it's not that that's a sort of formula that one must, absolutely follow every time one gets up in this pulpit, of course, but it is something that I've really tried to take seriously in my own preaching, to sort of foreground, even when I'm talking about the good works that God has prepared for us to walk in, right? The sort of what the life of discipleship of following Jesus looks like, to try to make it really clear that that's ultimately not something that we're doing to sort of earn our way into God's favor, and B, not something we're doing of our own power, but something that's done sort of by the power of the Holy Spirit, working in and through us.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good rule of thumb from Fleming Rutledge for sure. I think that this can be kind of related to the social justice piece, but I think one of the things that people took most issue with the Goodhue article was where he placed the blame on why the ACC has fallen apart, that the Anglican Church is too socially progressive. And again, as someone who has spent my whole life in the mainline church, this is a drumbeat that I have heard very regularly throughout my whole life, which is like, you're not going to grow a church by being socially progressive. If you anecdotally look at the more evangelical churches that have stronger stances against women in leadership and equal marriage and some of these other social issues, they're the ones that are growing and flourishing, and meanwhile we're old and declining, and surely it must be because of this is not the way that that the church needs to go. So I thought that you took a pretty thoughtful look at that all too easy conclusion to draw. What do you see as being the relationship between progressive theology and church decline?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. And I think I will say one of the things that I found a little frustrating myself about the Goodhue piece is I felt like there wasn't a lot of sort of nuance or clarity about what exactly he meant by just saying, it's because of progressivism. Yeah, I mean, I think that on one hand, it is true statistically that the sort of more socially progressive denominations have tended in at least North America to be sort of declining faster and to be declining faster. It's also true that being sort of theologically conservative is not a sort of, and specifically theologically conservative in the sense of, not having women in leadership or sort of not affirming same-gender marriage, that sort of thing, is not a silver bullet to prevent it either. I think we've seen some of the sort of small, actually the church that I grew up in, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, for example, it sort of is facing not quite as dire as ours, but a fairly dire demographic outlook. Even, the sort of Southern Baptist Church in the U.S., sort of seems to be cresting. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that this isn't, this relationship isn't sort of set in stone, even if it does seem to generally be true. And I think what I would really want to say is, as somebody who is personally committed to it, has sort of found himself in the main line in large part because of commitments to things like women in leadership or LGBTQ inclusion, is that there is nothing theologically necessary about those stances also including the position that evangelism doesn't matter, or sort of holiness of life is not important, or, I think for a variety of complicated historical reasons, the sort of social progressivism and this particular sort of theological liberalism have tended to go together, but I don't think they have to. And I think that there is a real opportunity for those of us who are committed, I dare say, for many of us, certainly for me, on sort of theological grounds to these sort of questions of inclusion, to show that a thriving church that nonetheless, welcomes women, welcomes LGBTQ people, etc., is in fact possible. And frankly, I think we, if indeed, as we are, often told that we need to particularly sort of foreground and then think about the kinds of needs and experiences of the most marginalized and those who have, been not had a place made for them in Christian spaces. I think that's actually all the more reason to be concerned about questions of decline and disappearance, right? Where, I want my gay Christian friends to be in a church that, welcomes both parts of that sort of enthusiastically, and if our churches don't exist, that won't exist,
Yeah. I think that's, if we go back to what you said earlier about like knowing Jesus matters, like that's kind of the fundamental point that we're working from. We're not working from the point that therefore, we do whatever it is to grow our churches. Like we want the starting point to be knowing Jesus matters. And
that's right.
And I certainly wouldn't know how to know Jesus if I couldn't be part of a church where women in leadership is recognized and where equal marriage is possible. Like that, I like how you frame that offering of church is really essential for a lot of people to know Jesus.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And also, like, I think statistics always need to be examined with a fine-tooth comb, because as I understand it, the evangelical churches are suffering from similar levels of decline, even if we're kind of further ahead on
that's right.
on the road of decline. So I appreciate your saying, like, it's appealing to think that it's just sort of a magic bullet of, like, if you proclaim these particular social stances, then you will have a thriving church. And I just think that is fantasy.
No, I absolutely think that is a fantasy. Although I also do want to say, as I think I sort of said before, that even though, like say, there is no silver bullet either way, and then ultimately God gives the growth, that the sort of commitments to evangelism and discipleship that are often associated more with people who hold those views than the sort of social progressive views, that does make a difference for people coming to life in Christ and for sort of having thriving churches.
Okay, so that just brings me right back to what I wanted to ask you next, because I did want to circle back to that piece about evangelism. So, you noted like there are some very unhelpful ways of proclaiming the gospel, especially in a pluralistic society. So, what do you think healthy and realistic evangelism can look like in our mainline context?
Yeah, another really great question. There's a book that I find myself often going to that was written specifically for a U.S. context, but I think is sort of more broader than that. It's a book called Unbinding the Gospel, a Real Life Evangelism by Martha Grace Reese. And what this book is it comes out of a big Lilly endowment. It's a U.S. foundation that funds a lot of sort of Christian and specifically often sort of mainline Protestant initiatives to look at mainline churches across denominations who had sort of consistently been able to have adult baptisms. And the idea being that sort of adult baptisms, especially in churches that practice infant baptism, sort of tends to indicate, not just people that are moving from one church to another, but people that are actually, we're not Christians, sort of becoming Christians.
Right.
And it's it's a book that I would really commend to people that are interested in sort of trying to think about these questions. I mean, I think one of the things that she talks about a lot, which I think is also really important, is sort of how can we build a culture in our congregations where people feel equipped and able to talk to other people in their circles about their faith, right? I think that we often in the mainline are sort of so anxious of coming off as, like a street preacher or like I don't know, sort of Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormon missionaries going door to door or whatever, that we are kind of nervous to talk about this at all. But, but if we have found something really amazing, as simple as, a TV show that we think is rad, we don't hesitate to talk to our friends and recommend that, right? And so I think maybe it's a silly example, but I do think that we need to sort of help our people into a culture of like low stakes but honest sort of talking about why it is that this matters to them, why it is that knowing Jesus matters to them, in a way that, then might lead them to feeling able to invite people, and then will lead to some of those people saying yes and having their lives, pray God, sort of transformed as a result.
Yeah, that's a great resource to recommend to our listeners. And, anecdotally, I'll just say, like, I've always heard that refrain that Anglicans aren't good at talking about their faith. And I just sometimes wonder whether, like, we as people in leadership just haven't bothered to ask. Because, like, when I find that people are very eager in my congregations to share about how prayer has made a difference, how walking with Jesus has helped them through hard times, how they have experienced grace and the hand of God at work in their lives. Like, I don't find that people are unable to articulate those things. I just think maybe we haven't been listening or inviting, right? Like, so yeah, I think that I love that kind of being a starting point, is to name our own experiences and be able to share that. Okay, when I read the Good Hugh article, when I read your writing in response to it, okay, it's saying like the Good Hugh article sounds like really bad news. The church that I serve has collapsed. It's just a matter of time. But at the same time, I find something pretty hopeful about that article and about the conversation that it has produced, because I think sometimes it can feel like we're all just pretending. And I have a lot of time that's why I'm involved in this podcast, for example, like for talking about what's really going on.
Yeah.
I'm a really big believer in like being honest about where we are, because then you can respond. Like it's pretty hard to respond when you're just pretending that things are different than they are. How did you feel about the Goodhue article? How do you feel about these realities? Do you kind of share that sense of hope?
I do. I mean, I think, yes, first of all, I think there was, yes, an experience of relief and, feeling like I'm not crazy when I sort of see someone else willing to say, no, like things actually are bad and it's actually a problem that they're bad, I mean, I think, yes, it feels, well, it's not my place to, I sort of, how do I want to put this? Yeah, I'll just leave it with this, that yes, I think there's a real sense of relief in feeling that the realities that I also sort of see so keenly and worry about so much, sort of seeing them named explicitly, sort of brought out into the light for us to look at. I mean, I think of in so many areas of life, and whether it's a lot of sort of therapeutic methods, or, think of like AA and 12-step programs and sort of things like that. I mean, it's sort of an axiom that, you can't actually really start to get better until you sort of stop denying that things are wrong and actually admit, that they are, and so, yes, I think in that sense, I do find it hopeful, in that I think that the way that we are going to move through to a sort of healthier place as well as the ACC, as sort of North American mainline in general, that we're not going to get there without first being able to be honest about where we're at, how we're doing, and what needs to change. And so in that sense, I do find this a much more hopeful conversation than pretending that things will, more or less just continue to go along the way that they have.
Yeah, for sure. So, if you were to be made the head of a mainline denomination, like nominations are open right now for Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, like just saying. But what would be your first move? Like what would be top of the priority heap?
Yeah. A great and challenging question. But I think the answer for me would be sort of trying to figure out how every single thing we do as a church is serving sort of evangelism and discipleship. I mean, it's something actually that I really appreciate about the new presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, that I think he has sort of been very straightforward about saying, right, that we can't be driven, that the sort of institutional maintenance can't be in the driver's seat, right? Sort of maintaining the structures as they've been can't be maintaining the driver's seat. Like, we need to be willing to ask some challenging questions about sort of how the things that we're doing sort of at the church-wide level, like, really are serving the gospel, and like be willing to let go of things that like may very well have been an important part of our church's work at some point, but just sort of don't make sense for the moment. And so, yeah, I think, whether it's sort of institutional analysis, or whether it's, the sort of formation of clergy and laity, just like figuring out how to keep that front and sort of first and foremost, and keeping that first and foremost not sort of from a place of anxiety about the like continued existence of our institution, but out of the like good news that we get to share about who God is. Yeah, I think I think that's, I've been excited to see sort of some mainline leaders sort of seem to take up that call, and that is the thing that like I would most love to see our leaders do. I think the thing that I'll sort of add as a corollary of that, and as I think something that is necessary for our church to have a compelling public witness to Christ, is, I'm thinking especially, I suppose, about England in this case, with, as you say, the new Archbishop of Canterbury up, but also Canada, also the Episcopal Church, really making it clear that clergy misconduct was not something that was going to be acceptable, and sort of figuring out what institutional changes needed to happen so that our churches were much safer places for people, and where it was a lot more difficult for clergy to get away with abusing the flocks under their charge, because you don't want to invite people into an institution that's not going to be safe for them, right?
Well, yeah, it is really hard to follow Jesus in the life of an institution where you experience abuse. Just bottom line. Yeah, I co-sign that absolutely 100%. Well, thank you for all of those really thoughtful answers to some, I think, pretty critical questions about what we're doing right now in the life of the mainline church. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back for our closing questions. Welcome back to The Future Christian and my conversation with the Reverend Ben Crosby. We're just going to wrap up with some closing questions, and we always tell our guests that you can take these questions as seriously as you want. You can be flip and irreverent if you want. You can be deep and serious if you want. Our first closing question is a slight variation on what I just asked you at the end of our main part of the conversation. But if you were Pope for the day, what would that day look like?
Well, as someone who, studies the Protestant Reformation with all, deep love and affection for my Roman Catholic friends, I'm inclined to jokingly say, well, dissolve the papacy, of course. But, let's go with, talked about the daily office at the beginning. Let's go with, mandate everyone pray, morning and evening prayer out of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. So we'll go with that. We'll go with that.
Okay, we're infiltrating the Vatican. I like it. What theologian or historical Christian figure would you want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh, this is such a dangerous question to ask somebody doing a PhD in church history. Because
I know. I have a variety of answers I'm imagining you might say.
Yes. I mean, Luther is someone who's been so important to me. And so, I'd love to get to chat with him, or I do a lot of work on Richard Hooker. And so, of course, it'd be lovely to talk with him. But actually, I've been thinking a bit lately, mostly because I've been reading her, both for my academic work and also for this sort of Christian formation group that I do for the church that I serve in Montreal over Zoom, about Catherine Parr, who is most as one of Henry's wives, but is really a formidable theologian in her own right.
I know, and so influential, so
influential. And so for today, let's say I would just love to have a good chat with Catherine Parr.
Okay, I'm on board with that. Back when Lauren interviewed me for this podcast before I was involved in hosting it, my answer, of course, was Anne Boleyn, but I'm glad to get another one of Henry's wives in the mix. Okay, what will history remember from our current time and place?
Yeah, I do think that this really is we are living in a moment of pretty dramatic change for Christianity in, at the very least, Europe and North America. And I guess for that matter, the sort of other places where there were European settler colonies like Australia and New Zealand, in that we are seeing the end of some 15, 16, sort of 1700 years of kind of publicly supported Christianity, whereby for good and for ill, and I think it really was a mix of both, the sort of Christians could count on either explicit political support or sort of implicit kind of cultural support for being Christians. And that era has now and really quite suddenly shifted. And so I think, what will the shape of the church in the plate, that will emerge sort of out of this change, I think remains to be seen. But I do really think, and I hope this isn't just, privileging the moment that I happen to be living in, but I do really think that, unless Jesus comes back first, that church historians, 300-400 years from now, will be looking at this moment as a quite significant one in Christian history.
Yeah, good answer. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity? That's kind of dovetails with what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think the my hope for Christianity's future is I guess the same hope that I have for it all along, that we will continue to be led by the Spirit to faithfully proclaim the good news of Christ crucified in every time and place, every cultural context in which we find ourselves, and that, God, by his power, would use our own sort of feeble words and actions to invite people to new and abundant life in him.
Beautiful. Where can people find more about you, Ben?
Yes, probably the best place to read my writing, and it's actually the place where this piece that we've been discussing today was published, is I have a Substack blog, bencrosby.substack.com.
And we'll include that in the show notes too.
Wonderful. I do also do some sort of public-facing writing in some other outlets. I write quite a bit, especially lately for Plow and the Anglican Way. So those are two other places you can Google and find some of my work if you are so interested.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much for our conversation today. I'm looking forward to talking more with you about some of these things. And we always end with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you, Ben.
Amen. Thank you so much, Martha. This has been a lovely conversation.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.